Imagine a coastline. Not the one you know from movies and textbooks, not the one with the dragon-headed prows and the battle cries. Something older, something quieter. The fog sits low on the water, thick and grey and slow-moving, the way fog does on northern seas in the hours just before the light fully arrives. And out of that fog shapes begin to emerge. Long, low hulls, dark with pine tar, riding the swells with a kind of practised ease, oars moving in rhythm. Not the urgent rhythm of men going to war, but the steady, measured pull of people who have been doing this for generations, who learned it from their parents, who learned it from theirs. You can almost hear it if you let yourself. The creak of wet timber flexing against the sea, the hollow knock of an oar in its notch, the sound of water being pushed aside and then folding back, salt in the air so thick you can taste it on your lips, and somewhere behind you on the shore, just visible through the tree line, a thread of hearth smoke rising into the pale sky. Someone waiting. Someone who knows these boats will come back because they always come back. This is the North Sea coast, somewhere between what we now call Denmark and Sweden and Norway, and the islands scattered between them. The year is not 793. It is not even close to 793. We are centuries before the raid on Lindisfarne that every history book uses as the starting pistol for the Viking Age. We are in a world that most people have never heard of, watching sailors who have no name in popular memory, crossing waters that will one day be famous for a people who came much later. And here is the thing that should stop you, should make you sit with it for a moment. These boats are not primitive. They are not the awkward experiments of people just figuring out how water works. They are the product of a seafaring tradition so old, so refined, so deeply embedded in the culture of the northern peoples that by the time the first Viking longship ever touched the waves, it was already the heir to something enormous, something that had been building for thousands of years in the silence and the fog and the pine-dark shorelines of the north. That is the puzzle at the centre of this story, not why the Vikings were so good at sailing. That question almost answers itself once you understand what came before. The real question is why we forgot the people who came before them, why the centuries of sea knowledge, the generations of builders and navigators and traders who worked these waters long before anyone called themselves Norse, why they dissolve so completely from popular memory that we speak of seafaring in the north as though it began with a dragon on a prow. If you're listening to this late at night or early in the morning with the lights low and sleep somewhere nearby, I want to know where you are. Drop a comment. Tell me what city, what country, what time it is where you're listening from. I read them, and it is genuinely one of the stranger and more wonderful things about making these, watching people fall asleep in Melbourne and Oslo and Buenos Aires, all at slightly different moments in the dark, now. The honest answer to why these sailors were forgotten is complicated, and we will get to it. But first I want to make you a promise about how this story is going to be told. Because there is a temptation, when you are dealing with people this old and this poorly documented, to fill the silence with myth, to reach for legend and saga and speculation and dress it up as history. We are not going to do that. What we are going to follow instead is evidence. Actual physical evidence pulled from bogs and burial mounds and coastal bedrock. Boats preserved in mud for 2,000 years. Rock carvings etched into granite surfaces overlooking the sea, showing hull shapes and crew sizes and details so specific that archaeologists can argue about the rigging. Burials where men were laid to rest inside the actual vessels that carried them through life, surrounded by objects that tell us who they were and how far they travelled and what they valued. This evidence exists. It is not sparse or ambiguous in the way that ancient history sometimes is. There is a remarkable amount of it, distributed across centuries and coastlines, and when you lay it all out in sequence, something emerges from the fog the same way those hulls did. A picture of a seafaring world that was sophisticated and connected, and in many ways the direct ancestor of everything that came after. We do not know what these people called themselves. We do not have their words or their stories. In many cases, we are not entirely certain which specific groups were responsible for which specific artifacts. There are real gaps in the record, and we will look at them honestly rather than pretend they are not there. But the boats are real, the carvings are real, the burials are real, and if you follow them carefully and quietly and with patience, they will take you somewhere remarkable. So let us begin at the beginning, which is also the beginning of the sea. Here is the thing about how history remembers people. It remembers the ones who wrote things down, or the ones who were written about by people who did. It remembers the ones whose stories got picked up by monasteries and kept in the cold and the candlelight through centuries of chaos. It remembers the ones who became useful to later nations, building their identities, the ones who fit neatly into a story someone wanted to tell about where they came from and why that mattered. The Vikings fit that story perfectly. They arrived with violence and left records. Their victims wrote about them in ink still dark with outrage. Their descendants composed sagas. 19th century Scandinavian nationalists needed heroic ancestors, and the Vikings were right there, ready-made, dramatic, impossible to ignore. Museums were built, paintings were commissioned, a whole machinery of romantic remembrance assembled itself around a people who were already vivid enough to survive the machinery's weight. The people who came before them had none of that. No monasteries kept their stories, no sagas reached back far enough to find them. When national romanticism went looking for Nordic ancestors, it stopped at the Viking Age because that was where the documents started, and documents feel solid in a way that artifacts sometimes do not. There is something about a written chronicle that commands belief even when the archaeology is telling you something just as detailed and far older. This is the essential asymmetry at the centre of this whole story. On one side you have narrative, which is loud and carries forward through time with tremendous force. On the other side you have objects, boats sealed in bog clay, stone carvings on exposed granite slopes facing the sea. Grave goods arranged around a skeleton with the careful logic of ritual. These things are quieter. They do not tell you their own story. They wait for someone to come and look and ask the right questions, and for most of history nobody was asking because nobody knew enough to know what questions to ask. So let us be clear about what this particular journey is and is not. We are staying firmly in the pre-Viking period. We are not going to wander into submerged landscape speculation or let the story drift into the mythological. Everything we follow will be grounded in what mainstream archaeology has actually excavated, dated, and argued over in peer-reviewed light. Where things are uncertain, we will say so. Where interpretations compete, we will hold them up and look at both of them honestly. What we are going to trace is a sequence. It begins in the Nordic Bronze Age, a world organised around the sea and the sun and the movement of goods across enormous distances, a world that left its ships carved into bedrock in numbers that are frankly staggering. From there we move into the development of actual surviving boat technology, the engineering logic that built one kind of hull and then slowly over generations built something better. Then through the turbulence of the migration period, when the North Sea became a different kind of stage, and into the Vendel era, where elite culture expressed itself through ships in ways that feel like a direct rehearsal for what came after. All of it leading toward a single threshold, a moment in the late 8th century when a tradition that had been accumulating for more than 2,000 years finally produced something that the written world could not ignore. We are not there yet. We are still in the long silence before it, and the silence has more in it than you might expect. Start with the geography, because the geography explains everything. Take a map of northern Europe and trace the coastline from what is now Denmark northward, along the Norwegian shore. Watch what happens. The coast does not behave like a coast. It dissolves. It fragments into thousands of islands and half-islands, and rocky outcrops and sheltered channels running between them, narrow passages where the water is calm even when the open sea beyond is churning. The Norwegians have a word for this landscape. Skjergård, the Garden of Skerries, a belt of broken rock and still water stretching along nearly the entire western and northern shore. It is not a wall between the land and the sea. It is a corridor, a long, sheltered, navigable highway running parallel to the continent, offering passage to anyone who understood its rhythms and had a vessel shallow enough to move through it. Add to this the fjords cutting deep into the mountains, reaching far inland, connecting the interior to the water in ways that no road could replicate, until roads became something more than mud and guesswork. Add the Baltic, that enormous enclosed sea to the east, more lake than ocean, its salinity low enough that its ice behaves differently from the open North Atlantic, its surface navigable across long stretches of summer, and dangerous but memorably navigable in winter, when it freezes solid enough for sledges. Add the inlets of Denmark, the island chains of what is now Sweden's west coast, the sounds and straits and tidal flats of the southern shore. Put it all together, and what you have is a landscape where water is not an obstacle. Water is the path. It has always been the path. In a world without roads, without bridges, without anything more sophisticated than a track through difficult forest. The sea is the easiest way to go anywhere. This matters because it changes how you have to think about the people who lived here. We tend to imagine ancient communities as land-bound, rooted to particular valleys or hillsides, venturing outward only with difficulty. But that model does not fit this coastline. On this coastline, going by water is faster than going by land. It is safer in most seasons, it carries heavier loads, it connects communities that would otherwise be isolated by mountains and bogs and the dense, lightless press of northern forest. Here, water does not separate people, it joins them. The communities that learned to use it well were not the exception. They were the ones who survived. Seasonality shaped everything. The light in these latitudes is not constant. Summer arrives and stays for what feels like forever. Long, pale evenings that extend the working day until you cannot quite believe the sun is still there. In midsummer above the Arctic Circle it does not set at all, and even further south the nights shrink to a few hours of grey half-darkness. This is the sailing season. Calm enough, light enough, warm enough. The social calendar organised itself around water. Communities traded and travelled and communicated and raided, and formed alliances in the long months of light. Then autumn came, the storms building, the seas growing unpredictable, the harbours filling with vessels pulled up beyond the tide line. Winter was for staying still, for repairing what the summer had damaged, for planning what the next summer would require. Then spring arrived with the first reasonable weather, and the rhythm began again. The harbours themselves were part of this knowledge. Not built structures, mostly, not in the earliest periods. Natural anchorages, beaches with gentle gradients where a boat could be run up without damage, river mouths wide enough to offer shelter, but navigable enough to enter under difficult conditions. The people who used these places knew them by name and by feel, passed the knowledge from one generation to the next the way you pass along any irreplaceable practical skill. This beach is safe in an easterly. That channel is deceptive at low water. The current runs hard past that headland in the afternoon when the tide turns. None of this was written down. All of it was known. The materials that made seafaring possible were close at hand. Pine grows straight and tall across enormous stretches of Scandinavia, its grain tight enough for planking, its resin sealing the wood against water. Oak grows further south, denser and harder, ideal for the structural members that have to take stress and flex without splitting. Tar came from pine heartwood, rendered in slow fires, worked into the seams of hulls to keep them watertight, its smell still preserved in some ancient finds as something almost familiar. The bogs that cover so much of northern Europe acted as accidental archives, their cold, acidic, oxygen-poor water slowing decay in ways that ordinary burial cannot match. Wood that would rot to nothing in a generation lasts for millennia in bog clay. This is the only reason we have any early boats at all. Not because the people of the Bronze Age were especially interested in preservation, simply because geography and chemistry did the work that intention could not. But what the bogs gave us is partial and selective. The vessels that ended up in bogs were not necessarily the typical vessels. They may have been the ones deliberately deposited there, sacrificed or buried as ritual acts, which tells us something important but not quite the whole picture. Thousands of other boats must have rotted on beaches, broken up on rocks, been repaired until nothing of the original remained. The archaeological record of early seafaring is full of these absences, gaps where you can feel the outline of something that isn't there. What you need to travel this coastline is not just a boat, it is a whole body of knowledge accumulated over generations and passed forward through practice. Reading water, understanding what a particular wave pattern tells you about what is happening further out beyond what you can see. Knowing the smell of weather, the way certain clouds behave before a change, the direction a wind will shift as a front approaches. Recognizing landmarks from the sea, the silhouette of a particular headland at dusk, the angle of a cliff face that tells you exactly where you are in a channel you have travelled a dozen times. These skills are not individual achievements. No single person develops them from nothing. They are social knowledge, built up across decades and centuries, held in a community the way language is held in a community, available to anyone who grows up inside it and learns to speak it fluently. This is the foundation on which everything else rests, before states. Before anything you could call a political unit, before any of the developments we are going to trace in the sections ahead, Small communities scattered along an enormous coastline, connected by water, organised around the seasonal rhythms of light and storm, carrying in their heads a detailed and precise knowledge of the sea, not writing it down, not yet, keeping it alive the only way knowledge can be kept alive without writing, by using it, by teaching it, by travelling the coast again and again until the water is as familiar as the land. This is where the story starts, not with a single origin point, not with a founding moment you can pin to a date, with a way of living that grew slowly into something remarkable, generation by generation, boat by boat, passage by passage, through centuries of practice so deep it eventually became something that looked, from the outside, like second nature. And in a way it was. This coastline had made these people just as much as they had learned to make the most of this coastline. The sea shaped them long before they left any record we can read. If you want to see these people begin to step out of the dark, you have to go inland a little, away from the harbours and the skerries, to bare rock that remembers boats long after the wood has gone. On the western coast of what is now Sweden, in Bohuslän, the bedrock is scarred with thousands of images chipped into the surface in the Bronze Age. At places like Tanum, whole hillsides are crowded with figures, animals, humans, weapons, spirals and cup marks whose meanings we can only guess at, and everywhere, boats. They are not small incidental details. They are the dominant motif. Long, shallow curves for hulls, upturned ends like stylized animal heads, rowers indicated by neat rows of strokes or tiny stick figures standing along the gunwale, sometimes so densely packed they almost merge into a continuous line. If you stand quietly in front of some of these panels, it feels like the rock has become a harbour wall, covered with graffiti from centuries of sailing seasons. One thing is immediately obvious. These are not single-person craft scratched by someone remembering a casual fishing trip. Boat after boat is shown with multiple crew, 10, 20, sometimes 30 marks along a hull, depending on how you count. Some carvings show several vessels together lined up in parallel, bows pointing the same way, as if part of a procession or a fleet. In a few, one boat is clearly larger, with more crew marks, sometimes with a taller, more elaborately curved prow, and smaller boats clustered beside it. The suggestion, at least, of hierarchy on the water. The shapes are surprisingly standardized. Over a wide region and across many different panels, the boats tend to follow the same basic outline. Sweeping keel line, sharply upturned stem and stern, occasional cross lines that might mark thwarts or ribs. This consistency is one of the reasons archaeologists are confident they are looking at particular kinds of vessels rather than random abstract forms. It also hints at something more important. Standardization in art often reflects standardization in reality. When different people in different communities draw the same kind of boat in the same way, it suggests that the underlying technology is widely shared. The context of the carvings matters. These boats are rarely alone. They move through busy scenes. Human figures raise axes or spears. Pairs of feet stride across the stone, legs exaggerated as if emphasizing motion. There are men with horned helmets, men carrying what might be shields, men engaged in what could be wrestling or combat or dance. Some panels have pairs of footprints carved into the rock, human-sized, carefully outlined, as if marking where someone is supposed to stand during a ceremony. Taken together, the boats look less like technical diagrams and more like stages for events. Many scholars think these scenes are ritual in nature. Processions to honour the dead, celebrations of alliances, displays of wealth and power. The boats in that reading are not just means of transport, they are symbols. Platforms where status is enacted, places where communities come together, visible from the shore, from other boats, from anyone watching. You can see this especially in the scenes that show boats apparently carrying weapons. There are carvings where rows of spears or axes rise from the hull like a forest, where a boat seems to be bristling with gear. You could interpret that as pure decoration, or you could see it as a very straightforward message. This is a warship, or at least a ship of warriors, a vessel crewed by people who matter. None of this proves a particular political structure. Rock art is not a census. But if you look carefully at the ordering of figures, patterns emerge. On some boats, one human stands at one end, larger than the others, sometimes holding an object that might be a steering oar, sometimes simply placed apart. The rest of the crew are smaller, more uniform. Whatever the exact story intended, this arrangement strongly evokes leadership. Someone at the prow or stern, directing, while the mass of the crew stand or row. To row together at all, you need more than arms and paddles. You need coordination. Boats with 10 or 20 rowers on each side cannot just improvise. They have to move in rhythm, pull with roughly the same force, respond to commands. Even if the carvings are stylized, the sheer number of crew marks tells us that Bronze Age boats in this region could carry enough people that organization on board became a problem to solve. Someone had to decide when to depart, how to load the vessel, what course to steer, when to pull harder, when to ease off. The images imply that these problems were solved routinely, season after season. The fact that the same boat shapes, the same upturned prows and crews in line, appear on multiple sites across Bohuslän and beyond tells us something else about organization. These people shared an iconography. They agreed, across valleys and inlets, on how to depict a boat. They agreed on which elements to exaggerate, which to leave out. That kind of agreement does not arise in isolation. It suggests ongoing contact, shared stories, shared ritual practices in which the boat was a central, recognized symbol. Archaeologists have proposed many functions for these rock panels. They might mark routes, visible from the water as you travel along the coast or up a fjord, reminding you that this is a place where people gather and remember. They might frame specific rock outcrops as ceremonial sites, where seasonal feasts took place and alliances were renewed. Some panels appear to have been reworked across generations, with new boats carved over older ones, lines crossing and layering, until the surface becomes a palimpsest of overlapping voyages. This has led to the idea that the act of carving itself was part of a memory-making process. You commemorate a journey, a successful raid, a marriage alliance, a burial by adding another boat to the stone. But we have to be careful about how far we push this. The rock does not come with captions. Dating is imprecise. Many of the Bohuslän carvings probably belong somewhere in the Middle and Late Nordic Bronze Age, broadly between about 1500 and 500 BCE, but the panels were likely made and remade over long stretches of time. You cannot look at a fleet scene and know whether those boats ever actually sailed together on a particular day. You cannot count the crew marks and be sure they reflect exact numbers on a specific type of vessel. Stylization compresses reality, turns messy practice into clean lines. Some researchers think the boats might sometimes be as much metaphors as machines. Solar bark imagery brought north from contacts with the Mediterranean, stripped of some details and blended with local forms, the upturned ends echoing horns or animal heads, the boats carrying the sun across the sky or the dead across the water to another realm. Others see in them a more grounded, almost documentary impulse. People recording what mattered most in their world. The boat that let you move, trade, fight, marry and return home. The safest position is somewhere in between. The Nydam and Bohuslän carvings are almost certainly not blueprints. But neither are they arbitrary doodles. They come from communities that invested enormous labour into chipping these shapes into hard rock, stroke by stroke, in places where others could see them. They tell us that boats were central enough to identity and memory that they deserve to be made permanent as anything could be in a landscape of wood and water. If you strip away the uncertainty, what remains is firm enough. By the Nordic Bronze Age, people along this coast were building large, crude vessels. They were coordinating rowers, appointing leaders, and moving in groups big enough that the idea of a fleet was meaningful. They were surrounding those vessels with ritual and story, turning them into symbols that outlived the planks themselves. The ships are gone, but their shadows are still there, carved into stone, waiting for us to trace their outlines and imagine the sound of many paddles hitting water in unison, somewhere beneath a sky that looks very much like the sky over Bohuslän today. Follow those shadows outwards, and you end up on the water itself, in a world that doesn't have a name in its own language, but that archaeologists now call the Nordic Bronze Age. Between roughly 1700 and 500 BCE, the entire rim of the northern seas changed character. From the Skagerrak and Kattegat through the Danish Straits into the Baltic, up along the Swedish and Norwegian coasts, over to Jutland and the North German shore, you can trace the same broad pattern. Scattered farms, yes, but tied together by inlets and sounds, by islands used as stepping stones, by channels that are safer and faster by boat than on foot. To live here, then, was to live in a mosaic. Low sandy coasts with lagoons and spits, rocky skerries punched out of the sea like broken teeth, long, narrow fjords biting inward. The line between land and water was frayed and complicated. full of places to beach a hull, to pull a boat up, to drag it over a low portage and slide it down into another sheltered bay. The people who occupied this edge seem to have leaned into that geography. Their wealth, where we can see it, clusters near the coast or along big navigable waterways. Hordes of bronze tools and weapons appear close to good harbours. Large burial mounds and barrows rise on promontories that command views over shipping lanes. When you look at a distribution map of important Bronze Age finds in southern Scandinavia, it is hard not to see a maritime network sketched out in dots and lines, like the faint ghost of a route map drawn centuries after the fact. Within this network, boats were not an optional extra. They were the connectors that made the whole system work. A journey that might take days on foot through forest or bog could be done in hours by hugging the coastline, pulling into familiar coves, exchanging news at places where others also habitually stopped. Over time, those stopping points hardened into nodes, places with seasonal markets, with shrines, with carved rocks like those in Bohuslän, with people whose job it was to host, to mediate, to remember who owed whom. Out on those waters, another idea was travelling too, one that is harder to map but just as important. The idea that the course of the sun, the movement of light across the sky, was itself a kind of voyage. Many scholars think that by the Middle Bronze Age, communities around the Nordic seas participated in a loose sun cult, a set of beliefs and practices that treated the sun as a power that needed to be honoured, maybe even helped along in its daily and yearly journeys. The most famous object tied to this interpretation is not from the coast at all, but from a bog in Denmark, the so-called Trundholm sun chariot, a small model showing a horse pulling a gilded disc on a wheeled frame. Whether or not it was literally meant to depict the sun being hauled across the heavens, it tells us that people here were thinking about the sun as something that could be carried, moved, maybe even transported by a vehicle. Now bring that idea back to the rock carvings, to all those boats. On some panels a circle floats above a hull, on others discs are attached directly to the boat, or the prow seems to cradle a round shape. There are scenes where a boat appears to approach a large sun-like circle, and others where the circle seems to ride inside the vessel. None of this comes with instructions. We cannot be sure these are solar barges in the strict Egyptian sense, ferrying the sun god across the sky or through the underworld. But the repetition of circles, the way they interact with ships and with human figures in what look like ritual postures, has persuaded many researchers that at least some boats were imagined as carrying more than people and cargo. They were vehicles for powers, for light, for the dead. If you think about how these people experienced the world, that possibility makes a kind of quiet sense. The sea is a moving mirror. On clear evenings, the sun drags a long path of gold across the water toward you. On certain days, at certain latitudes, it seems to sink directly into the horizon line, vanishing into the same element that your boats vanish into when they go out of sight. To people who spent much of their lives watching the sky and the surface of the sea together, the idea that the sun might itself travel by boat, that its path and their paths were somehow linked, would not feel abstract. It would feel observed. This imagery does not just sit on rocks. It seeps into objects that would have flashed and chimed in real ceremonies. Bronze razors with tiny boat motifs on their blades, ornaments stamped with pairs of spirals and ships, belt plates carved with concentric circles that might mark the sun's course through the year, sometimes with little arcs at the edge that look very much like stylized hulls. When an elite woman fastened such a plate at her waist, or when a man shaved with a razor decorated with a miniature ship, they were literally putting these symbols on their bodies. The houses they returned to after those rituals and voyages were long and low, timber frames stuffed with wattle and daub, thatched roofs running almost comically far along the ground. Excavations of large longhouses from this period show central halls with room for feasting, for gatherings, for the kind of display that makes status visible. Hearths line the centre. Post holes mark off spaces that might have been for animals, for sleeping, for storage. In some of the richest sites there are traces of specialised activity. Metalworking areas, fine pottery, imported objects. In these halls, identity was performed and reinforced. Chiefs or leading families hosted guests. They poured out beer or mead. They brought out weapons with shining bronze blades, neck rings, belts, pins, all outrageously costly in a region with no native copper or tin. They might have pointed to a hoard that had been ceremonially buried nearby, or to a barrow on the hill where an ancestor lay with similar gear. In that setting, the boat was never far away. The men and women who mattered were often the ones who had been abroad, who had contacts across the water, who could summon distant allies. Travelling craftsmen might have sat at those tables too, smiths who knew the secret ratios of copper to tin, carvers who understood the shared language of ship and sun motifs that stretched from Norway to Jutland to the southern Baltic. Bronze itself was the magnet that pulled those networks tight. There is no getting around the geography. Scandinavia has abundant stone, timber and later iron, but in the Bronze Age the metals that defined status had to come from far away. Copper and tin flowed north in fragmentary form, ingots, scrap metal, perhaps old weapons melted and recast. The exact routes are debated, but isotope analysis of metal objects suggests connections that ran deep into Central Europe and beyond, linking Nordic shores to river systems leading toward the Alps and the Carpathians. Every polished sword, every decorated axe, every gleaming belt plate on a Scandinavian farm was a quiet testimony to journeys made and exchanges negotiated. Someone had to sail to the southern Baltic, or to the mouths of the great rivers in what is now Germany and Poland. Someone had to meet intermediaries, exchange amber, hides, furs, maybe even people, for the raw materials of prestige. Someone had to bring that metal back, design objects that fit local tastes and local cosmologies, and then give or display those objects in ways that bound followers to leaders. You can feel the feedback loop here, even if the details blur. Belief made certain things meaningful. The sun's progress, the ship as more than transport, the ancestor sleeping under the mound with a sword at his side. Trade brought in the physical stuff to make those meanings visible, bronze discs to stand for the sun, blades to be raised in ritual, razors and pins to decorate bodies. Power flowed along the same routes that the metal did, concentrating where people could control access to boats, to ports, to foreign contacts. And then that power was justified and dramatized by pointing back to the beliefs. We rule because we keep the cycles turning, because we host the feasts, because we own the ships that carry the gifts to and from the horizon. How conscious all of this was, we do not know. We do not know if anyone in a longhouse on a Jutland headland ever sat back and thought, in so many words, that their authority rested on their control of a maritime trade in exotic metals wrapped in solar symbolism. What we see instead are fragments, carvings of boats under circles, burnt layers from feasts, longhouses with rich graves nearby, hoards of bronze deliberately buried in wetlands and shorelines as offerings. But taken together, they point toward a culture where sea, sun, metal and memory were inseparable. A world where the daily act of pushing a boat off a beach and feeling it lift on the swell was entangled with stories about how light moves, how ancestors travel, how wealth appears and disappears. A world in which to be someone was to be tied into that floating web of journeys. And through that web, the North did not just receive, it also sent things out. One of those things was amber, hard fossilized sunlight from the cold Baltic shores, heading south along routes we can just begin to trace. Follow those amber threads southward, and the web suddenly widens. On storm-stripped beaches along the Baltic, people in the Bronze Age picked their way through rack lines of seaweed and driftwood, looking for small, irregular glows. Amber doesn't look like much when it's still wet and tangled, but once it's dried and polished, warmed in the hand, rubbed to a soft shine, it catches light in a way that feels almost alive. It smells faintly of resin when worked or burned. It holds static when you stroke it. It is, in every sense, fossilized light. Archaeology lets us follow that light as it leaves the northern shore. In graves in Mycenaean Greece, from roughly the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, beads of Baltic amber have been found threaded among gold, faience, and fine ceramics. Chemical and isotopic analyses match those beads not to local resins, but to deposits around the Baltic Sea. Farther still, in tombs in Egypt from the late New Kingdom, small pieces of amber have been recovered whose composition again points north, toward cold coasts and conifer forests. Those are facts, artifacts you can hold in a museum, objects that once lay on the chests and wrists of people whose names we sometimes still know, in palaces whose ruins have been dug stone by stone from the ground. From that, certain things follow with quiet, stubborn logic. If Baltic amber ends up in Mycenae and Thebes, there must have been routes that connected those places, not single heroic journeys from Jutland to the Nile, but chains of exchange, hand to hand to hand, carried in packets and pouches and small wooden boxes. When we talk about amber routes, then, we are really talking about a series of overlapping paths and relationships. Some followed rivers, the Vistula, the Oder, the Elbe, the Danube. Some hugged coasts, along the southern Baltic, around the tip of Jutland, into the North Sea, perhaps down the Atlantic facade, or across to the river mouths of the Low Countries and northern France. We do not have a map drawn by Bronze Age traders. We have distributions of finds, clusters of rich graves, stray beads, and broken pins that mark points along an invisible line. Some segments of that line are clearer than others. In Central Europe, from modern Bohemia down into the Danube corridor, archaeologists have traced assemblages rich in both amber and southern goods. There, the idea of an amber road is anchored by settlements, hoards, and burials that show a blend of northern and Mediterranean influences. Between those middle stretches and the Baltic coasts, the record thins. We find amber hoards in northern Germany and Poland. We know people there had boats, that they lived in landscapes cut by rivers flowing south. But exactly who carried what, along which channel, in which season, remains out of reach. It is tempting to imagine a single intrepid northerner standing in the forecourt of a Mycenaean palace, looking up at painted columns, hearing a language utterly unlike his own. That might have happened once or twice. Long-distance travel is not impossible for individuals. But the pattern in the ground whispers something more mundane and more powerful. Intermediaries, coast-to-river specialists, people whose importance came from knowing the next link in the chain, not the final destination. For the Nordic Bronze Age shore communities, the crucial part was the first leg. Amber does not walk itself to the south. It had to be gathered, sorted, worked, and then offered in exchange for other things that moved in the opposite direction. We've already watched copper and tin flow north in the form of raw metal. Alongside those, other materials probably came too. Finished bronze objects from Central Europe reworked into Nordic styles, glass beads from far to the south, rare stones, maybe even textiles and dyes. Not all of this is equally visible. Metal survives. Cloth usually does not. Glass appears here and there in small quantities. Its origins are harder to pin down. But the presence of foreign designs on local objects, spiral motifs, sword forms, decorative quirks that clearly trace back to Central European and Mediterranean models, shows that goods were not the only things travelling. Ideas were moving too. A new way to shape a sword blade, a fresh pattern for a belt plate, perhaps even stories about distant lands, told second-hand by someone who had only ever met someone who had met someone who had been there. We can hear an echo of this in the way prestige seems to crystallise around certain nodal places. A headland controlling an approach to a good harbour. A settlement where a river opens into a lagoon. A farm cluster backed by barrows and fronted by a sheltered beach. In those spots, the people in the big longhouses were not just rich farmers, they were gatekeepers. If you wanted your amber to start its southern journey, you probably dealt with them. If you came north with bronze, glass or news from the middle reaches of the route, you likely tied up at their shore. Seafaring in that context becomes more than a means of getting from A to B. It becomes a way of organising power. Someone had to know the safe passages through shoals and skerries, the inlets that were welcoming and the ones that were hostile, the seasonal rhythms of wind and current. Someone had to guarantee that a visiting trader and his cargo would not be robbed between one bay and the next. Those guarantees are not written down, but their shadows fall across patterns of wealth and monument building. To control a stretch of coast was to control who could join the chain of exchange, and on what terms. From that control, status followed. A chief who could promise safe escort for southbound amber and northbound metal would accumulate both material wealth and obligations. He could take a cut of the goods, host feasts to display them, and spin a story in which his family's authority was part of the same order that moved the sun and the seasons. Alliances could be forged by marriages arranged between nodes on this network, perhaps cemented by the exchange of objects whose value everyone recognized. A cache of amber, a particularly fine sword, a new style of ornament that marked its wearer as plugged into faraway fashions. We should be honest about how much of this is inference. We know the amber was there in Greece and Egypt. We know that boats lined the Nordic rock carvings, that hoards of bronze cluster along coasts and rivers, that foreign styles appear in local graves. We know that river systems and seas physically connect the Baltic to the Mediterranean world. From these pieces, archaeologists build plausible models of trade networks, of multi-stage routes where goods changed hands many times. But whether a Nordic Bronze Age sailor ever personally watched the walls of Troy rise from the water, or walk the quays of a Cypriot port, is a question the soil has not yet answered. The silence between the artifacts leaves room for many individual stories, most of which we will never hear. What we can say is that by the middle of the second millennium BCE, the northern seas were no longer a cul-de-sac at the edge of the known world. They were plugged into a continental system of value and exchange. Ships carved on Scandinavian rocks, laden with what looks like sun and ancestors, were also, at least sometimes, carrying very practical cargo. Beads of ancient resin that would eventually glow on the bodies of queens and princes far to the south. And as those ships went and came, season after season, they did something else as well. They trained generations of pilots, warriors, traders, and storytellers in the disciplines of the water, how to read a horizon, how to trust a hull, how to make your living from the spaces between lands, skills and social habits that would, much later, be recognized as the defining talents of a very different set of northern seafarers. But long before anyone heard of Vikings, those patterns were already taking shape, wave by wave, along the amber roads of the Bronze Age sea. If you want to see what all that quiet coastal training produced, you can walk into a museum in Copenhagen and stand in front of it. The Hjortspring boat is older than the Roman Empire, about 3.5 centuries before the birth of Christ, yet it looks like something dreamed up from those Bronze Age rock carvings, sleek, narrow, rising at both ends like the curved horns of some sea animal. It was found, not on a beach, but buried in a bog on the Danish island of Als, under layers of peat and centuries of forgetfulness. When the peat cutters exposed it in the 1920s, they were looking at the best preserved warship from prehistoric northern Europe. Warship is a strong word, but there is something undeniably purposeful about Hjortspring. The hull is built from a single great linden log, hollowed and then extended with thin planks sewn on along the sides. Those planks overlap one another in a way that feels like an early echo of the famous clinker technique of later centuries. Not true clinker yet, not the robust iron-riveted shell you see in Viking ships, but a kind of wooden quilting, each board lapping the next, stitched together with fibres and sealed with pitch and organic caulking. The whole thing is astonishingly light. Empty, 2 or 3 people could probably lift it. In use, it carried maybe 20 warriors on each side, plus helmsmen and a commander. 40 men moving as one, guided by someone who understood timing and rhythm and the way a boat talks through its hull. This is not a clumsy dugout shoved into a lake for a quick crossing. It is a hull optimized for speed, for acceleration under muscle power, for slewing around quickly in shallow water. Its sides are thin, its internal framework carefully shaped. Everything about it says, get in, paddle hard, get where you're going fast and don't hit anything. And yet, for all that elegance, the Hjortspring boat we know never saw open water again after the day it went into the bog. It lay there surrounded by more than just wood. The excavators found shields by the dozen, spears, swords, arrowheads, bits of armour, fragments of clothing and equipment. Many of the weapons were deliberately broken, bent or snapped in ways that made them useless. Some carried stylistic traits that look foreign, pointing perhaps to enemies from across the sea or from some other region of the Baltic world. All of it together, boat, weapons, gear, had been laid carefully into a former lake, then sealed by peat. What does that mean? Most archaeologists read Hjortspring as a votive deposit, an offering to the powers that dwelt in water and bog. Perhaps it marks a victory, the captured equipment of a defeated raiding party ceremonially killed and given to the lake. Perhaps it commemorates a costly defence, a moment when local warriors turned back an invasion and wanted that story anchored in the landscape. Perhaps, more simply, it was part of a long habit of thanking the gods for safe return from dangerous journeys by surrendering the very tools that made that return possible. We do not have an inscription to tell us the story. We have patterns, parallels, comparisons. In later centuries and elsewhere in northern Europe, people throw whole war kits into wetlands: shields, swords, spears, helmets. The Hjortspring find fits that logic, but on a grander scale. Here the boat itself is part of the offering, the vehicle that carried men into battle and back, laid down as if to rest in another kind of harbour. Whatever the precise backstory, Hjortspring proves more than one thing. It proves that by the middle of the 4th century BCE, some northern communities could build large, coordinated warcraft. They could fell and shape massive trees, fashion delicate planks, drill and sew them into a flexible, watertight skin. They could assemble crews of dozens of men, train them to paddle in rhythm, and integrate their movement with a commander's intent. That means hierarchy, planning, logistics. Who cuts the wood, who keeps the boat hauled out and maintained, who decides when to launch, who supplies food and weapons for 40 hungry warriors on campaign. It also proves that water was no longer just a medium for trade and travel. It was a battlefield. Ships like Hjortspring, whether this one was typical or elite, turned coastlines into fluid frontiers. A group of men in such a craft could cross a sound or an inlet quickly, strike at an enemy farm cluster or landing place, and vanish back into the skerries before a land-based response could organise. They could also patrol, escort traders, and show the flag in a very literal way. A long, menacing line of shields and spears gliding along the horizon. But there are limits to what Hjortspring can tell us. Its construction shows that its builders understood the sea, how to keep a light hull flexible, how to lift it over shoals, how to ride waves instead of punching through them. It is clearly seaworthy in the sense that it can move along coasts, cross straits, and operate in choppy northern waters if handled by skilled crews. Experimental reconstructions have paddled similar boats for impressive distances. What we cannot read from it is the full scale of their voyages. Was Hjortspring-type craft routinely taken far out into the open Baltic, or did it mostly hug the safer inner waters between islands and peninsulas? Did its crews make overnight crossings guided by stars and coastal silhouettes, or did they work by day, always within sight of land? The hull hints, the bog does not answer. We see the technology and the organisation. The exact itineraries remain in the realm of possibility, not proof. The way Hjortspring ended its days too links it back to a much older pattern. In the rock carvings, we saw boats carrying sun discs and coiled spirits, boats that seemed as much ritual diagrams as practical machines. Here, in a waterlogged hollow on Als, that dual nature becomes literal. A very real, very functional warboat, scarred perhaps by use, filled once with shouting men, is transformed into a sacred object. It is disarmed, surrounded by silent weapons, and surrendered to the dark water. The people who did that were not confused about its value. They knew exactly what they were giving up. In that sacrifice you can feel how deeply boats had come to matter, not just as tools but as symbols. They were extensions of a community's strength, bearers of its young men, carriers of its wealth and its fears. To place one in a bog was to speak loudly, in the language of things, about power, gratitude, and perhaps anxiety. From the Bronze Age onward, across the north, ships would keep inhabiting this double role. They would be the everyday vehicles of trade and fishing and travel, and at the same time they would be woven into stories about gods and ancestors, victories and losses, life and death. Hjortspring sits right at that intersection, a ghostly hull rising from peat, reminding us that in this world, the logic of war at sea was never just about tactics or timber. It was about how a people understood themselves, and what they were willing to consign to the depths when the fighting was done. After Hjortspring, it would be tempting to jump straight to something like a Viking longship, as if one clean line ran from paddles in a bog to dragon prows in a saga. The real story is slower, more braided, and much harder to see. For a long time after Hjortspring, most of what we have from the north is absence. Iron rusts, ropes rot. Sails, if there were any, collapse into nothing. Even wood only survives in special places. Bogs, lake bottoms, old river channels where the mud goes anoxic and forgets to let oxygen in. So what we are about to follow is less a parade of famous ships and more a set of glimpses. A plank here, a fastening there, a faint imprint of a technological conversation carried on for centuries along coasts that left almost no written words. If you took the ghost of the Hjortspring hull and sailed it slowly forward through time, through the late Iron Age and the centuries in between, you would feel the boat changing around you, the shell first. Bronze Age builders in the Nordic world had already learned that a boat does not have to be carved from a single log. You can peel the tree into planks and sew them together, turning a solid trunk into a thin, flexible skin. Hjortspring shows that logic. The central dugout deepened and widened by overlapping boards stitched with plant fibres and animal sinew, flexible, creaking but strong. Over the next half-millennium, that shell deepens and hardens. Planks are still overlapped, still lapping like fish scales, but the stitching starts to be helped and then replaced by other fastenings. Before iron nails become common, some builders experiment with wooden pegs, tree nails driven through plank and plank into underlying timbers. Others keep sewing but add tighter frames inside, ribs that bind the whole body of the boat into a more coherent form. Those ribs are a quiet revolution. In a very early plank boat, the shell is the structure. You build a skin, then only later add a few light supports. As the Iron Age ripens, the relationship inverts. Frames are shaped to fit the curves of a known hull form. Keel, planking, ribs begin to work together, sharing the load. The boat becomes less like a basket and more like a sprung muscular animal that can take the strain of surf, cargo and, eventually, oars. Alongside this, people are solving the small invisible problems that don't show up well in museums but matter every time anyone goes to sea. How do you stop water from weeping in through every seam between those carefully shaped boards? Bronze Age builders stuffed moss and animal hair and plant fibres into the gaps, then smeared them with pitch from burned pine or birch. Through trial and error, Iron Age communities refine the recipes. Some tars stay sticky in heat, some flake and crack in frost. Somewhere, along some winter shore, someone discovers that adding certain oils, resins or ashes makes a brew that stays flexible longer, that clings better to wood. The knowledge spreads, not in texts, but in talk around boat sheds and fires. Steering, too, is gradually reimagined. A long, narrow hull responds differently from a log canoe. You can drag a paddle in the water to bring the stern around, but as ships lengthen and carry more men and cargo, that becomes harder and less precise. By the last centuries before the Common Era, we start to see side rudders, steering oars mounted on the right-hand side of the stern, the steerboard that will someday give its name to starboard. A shaped blade, a strong loom, a set of lashings, and perhaps a leather thong to help bear the weight. Again, we have very few complete examples from this early period, but by the time better preserved boats appear, the system is fully mature. That implies generations of tinkering in the dark. Under human power, the change from paddles to oars is subtle but profound. Paddles ask the paddler to be part of the water, switching sides, twisting the torso, working close to the hull. Oars take that effort outboard. You pin a long pole to the gunwale with a rowlock or a rope loop and let the lever do some of the work. That shift allows a different hull form, higher sides, more freeboard, more cargo and more men without losing speed. It also changes the rhythm on board. Instead of the drumming, almost individual cadence of paddlers, you get long strokes, timed to a caller's voice or a drummer's beat, running down the length of the ship like a wave. We do not have an exact moment when the North switches from paddles to oars. Rock carvings from the Bronze Age show figures that could be either. Some early finds suggest hybrid crews, paddles in the bow for manoeuvrability, oars amidships for long hauls. By the early Roman Iron Age, the logic of oared warcraft is clearly present. Narrow, high-sided hulls built to carry lines of men, each with his own lever into the sea. And somewhere inside this slow, practical evolution sits a much more elusive question. When did northern boats first stretch a piece of cloth to catch the wind? We know that sails existed nearby. The Mediterranean had them for millennia. Phoenician and Greek ships cut back and forth along warm coasts, with square rigs and complicated rigging well before Hjortspring ever cracked a wave. Further south in Europe, rivercraft and coastal traders adopt small sails as auxiliary power. It would be astonishing if no one from the Baltic or North Sea ever saw such a thing. Direct evidence in the north, though, is thin before the late Roman and migration periods. Sails themselves leave almost nothing. Cloth rots. Hemp and wool and linen leave only ghostly discolorations in the soil, if that. What we are left to search for are the fingerprints of sails on things that do survive. Mast steps cut into keels, reinforced thwarts, beefed-up frames where a mast partner might brace against the strain of wind. There are a few candidates, some fragmentary hulls from southern Scandinavia and northern Germany, in the early first millennium CE show strengthened centres that some archaeologists argue could have carried a small mast. A couple of rock carvings from the very end of the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age showboats, with what looks like a pole and a rectangular panel above them. Are these sails, or stylized standards, or symbols? No consensus. Some bog offerings include long, straight timbers that could be interpreted as masts, but without their context in a complete hull, the case is weak. Mainstream archaeology tends to stay cautious here. The safe claim is that by the late Roman Iron Age and the following centuries, sailing rigs are appearing in northern waters in at least some form. Before that, we are in a grey zone of possibilities. Perhaps small coastal craft carried temporary fair weather sails. Perhaps ambitious traders rigged simple squares on sturdy oared hulls to help on long legs with the wind behind them. Perhaps the technological and social investment just wasn't worth it yet, and the old partnership of paddles, oars, and cunning seamanship did the job, because even without visible sails, the real engines of these early voyages were not always the men pulling on oars. They were the roots in people's heads. Navigation leaves almost nothing in the ground. You will not dig up a memory of how the evening star sinks behind a particular headland at midsummer, or how a line of darker water over there means a hidden shoal. Yet those were the tools that let Bronze and Iron Age mariners turn shallow, rock-strewn coasts into something like a highway. Day to day, they probably sailed and rowed by what is called pilotage, keeping land in sight, reading bays and inlets, hopping from island to island. Each stretch of coast would have its own set of named features, its own stories to fix them in the mind. A dangerous rock might be the tooth of a drowned giant. A narrow channel might be where a god once squeezed a ship through sideways. Myth and memory do the work of charts. At night, or in open stretches of water, the sky becomes another coastline. The north has long, luminous summer nights when stars are faint, but also long winters when constellations wheel bright and low. Over generations, patterns would emerge. This star sits above that cape when you are on the right line. That cluster marks the turning point for a crossing. Add to that an almost unconscious feeling for wind shifts, for the taste of the air, for the rhythm of swell under the hull, and you begin to sense the invisible equipment that made these journeys possible. None of this was written down. It was held in people, passed as instructions from steersman to apprentice, as half-remembered warnings at feasts, as quiet corrections shouted over the wind when someone steered a little too close to the wrong reef. When archaeologists talk about continuity in northern boat building, they're talking about this kind of thing as much as about planks and fastenings. Generation after generation, along fjords and skerries and low muddy estuaries, people who had never heard of the Bronze Age sun ships, people who had never lived to see a Viking longship, kept working with the same problems. How to keep out water, how to make a hull both stiff and supple, how to marry wood and fibre and tar into something that could trust the sea and be trusted in return. The forms change. Stitching gives way to rivets. Light war canoes stretch into cargo carriers. Somewhere, sooner or later, a mast rises and a square of cloth snaps in the wind. But beneath all of that runs an unbroken labour, hands learning from hands, coasts teaching the people who live along them. By the time a ship like Nydam is built, in the first centuries of our era, all of this patient, mostly invisible refinement has accumulated. We can finally see the shell clearly again in surviving wood, and in that wood the memory of 1,000 forgotten experiments at the water's edge. When the Nydam ship finally comes into view, it feels almost abrupt, as if someone has turned on the lights in a room we've only known by touch. Built around the year 320, during the late Roman Iron Age, it was laid carefully into a peat bog in southern Jutland with its planks still strong, its fastenings still holding. When it was unearthed in the 19th century, archaeologists suddenly had not a ghost, not a handful of timbers, but an entire seagoing hull from the centuries before the Viking Age, preserved in enough detail that you can trace the thinking of its builders from keel to gunwale. Nydam is clinker-built in a way Hjortspring only hinted at. The planks along its sides overlap in long, even strakes, each board fastened to the next with rows of iron rivets clenched over little square iron washers. Where Hjortspring's skin is stitched and flexible, Nydam's is nailed and tightened, a continuous shell that ripples with regular curves instead of wobbling with lashings. Inside, the frames and crossbeams bind that shell into a single integrated body. Keel, planks, ribs, thwarts, all are shaped to one another, each piece assuming the presence and strength of the others. It is long and narrow, about 23 metres from stem to stern, with room for 14 oars a side. No paddlers now. These are full oars, working outboard on loops, arranged in a disciplined line. At full complement, Nydam may have carried a crew of 30 or 40, perhaps more if there were extra fighting men or passengers. Under oars, she would not have been a plodding barge. Hydrodynamic studies and experimental replicas suggest a speed easily in the range of 6 or 7 knots, faster in short bursts if the men were strong and the water kind. Speed, though, is only half the story. The other half is coordination. An oared ship this long only moves well if everyone works together. The stroke at the stern has to set the rhythm. The men along the midships benches have to feel that rhythm in their backs and legs, not just in their arms. The steering oar on the starboard quarter, that evolved steerboard, has to anticipate each wave, each gust, each slight lurch as the rowers change pace. To keep Nydam running true for hours in open water requires training, commands, and a shared understanding of what the hull can and cannot do. That kind of discipline does not appear overnight. It implies crews that have rowed together before, officers or coxswains who know how to call the beat. A culture in which time and effort are being spent not just on building such a ship, but on learning how to use it to its limits. The context in which Nydam was found sharpens this picture even more. The ship did not die in some random storm. It was not dragged ashore as scrap, it was sacrificed. In the bog that bears its name, archaeologists found not only the hull, but the remains of multiple vessels, along with thousands of weapons, spears, shields, swords, arrowheads. Many of them had been deliberately broken or bent. The pattern is familiar from other northern bog deposits. These are war spoils, offerings of captured gear and perhaps captured craft, presented to the gods or the powers of the place after a victory. To sink an entire, still usable ship like Nydam into a bog as part of such a rite tells us several things at once. It tells us that in this world, ships had become central objects of prestige and power. You do not give up what cost you nothing. To build a hull of this size you need tall, straight oak, harvested from well-managed woodland. You need blacksmiths to make and clench hundreds of rivets, carpenters who can shape planks with exact, gentle curves, rope makers and tar burners and leather workers. You need food to keep all of them going while the hull rises rib by rib in the boat shed. That implies resource mobilization on a significant scale, forests under control, iron smelting and distribution, labour organised over months and months. Someone is directing this effort, a chieftain, a war leader, a council of elders perhaps, and someone is convincing a community that pouring this much wealth into a single warship is worthwhile. Once built, a Nydam-type ship demands upkeep. Planks must be recorked, seams watched, rivets checked for corrosion, oars replaced. In the hands of a careless owner, it will rot on the shore within a few seasons. The very fact that such a vessel could be kept seaworthy long enough to earn the honour of a ritual deposition suggests an infrastructure of harbour places, boat sheds, maintenance crews, and the quiet routines of logistics. Grain and smoked meat for the rowers, spare gear, repair tools, designated landing sites along familiar routes. Standing beside the Nydam ship in a museum today, it is tempting to see it as an early Viking longship that somehow arrived 4 centuries ahead of schedule. The lines are not identical. Nydam has no clear mast step. If it ever carried a sail, it was not the dominant source of power. Its bow and stern are different from later, more refined warships. But the family resemblance is undeniable. The long clinker hull, the dense forest of oars, the stressed elastic structure meant to move quickly over choppy northern seas. What Nydam really does is push back the horizon of our expectations. It forces us to accept that by the early 4th century, centuries before the raid on Lindisfarne, people in southern Scandinavia were already building and operating highly capable seagoing warships. Not lashed-together canoes, not experimental coastal craft. Full-scale, purpose-built engines of power, embedded in societies that could afford to treat even such marvels as expendable offerings, when politics, warfare and religion demanded a gesture on that scale. When we talk about the pre-Viking world, Nydam reminds us that we are not looking at a primitive backdrop waiting for the main act. We are looking at a mature maritime culture in its own right, with its own technologies, its own traditions of seamanship, its own systems of rank and reward woven into the planking of its ships, and just downstream from Nydam, in both time and space, other hulls will appear, different answers to the same questions about speed, range and control, each one taking the inherited engineering of power a little further out into the open sea. If Nydam shows us the machine, the centuries that follow hint at the hands that held its steering oar. Because by the time Rome is faltering, the North Sea has become something stranger and more dangerous than a mere stretch of water between shores. It is a field of possibilities, a dark, shifting roadway along which men, families, treasure, stories, and fear can all move in both directions at once. On the southern coasts, power is no longer a solid wall like the Empire. It is fragmented, nervous, always in motion. Chieftains rise and fall in Jutland, along the Frisian marshes, in the deltas of the Rhine and Elbe. Each controls a few stretches of beach, some tidal inlets, a hinterland of farms and cattle. None of them by themselves is a king in the later sense, but each can call out men, gather ships, and make promises. Those promises travel with the oar strokes. Some of these warbands head south to serve Roman officers as foederati, allies on stipends. Others look west, across the grey band of the North Sea, towards the misted line of Britain. To a man standing in a prow, the island is not yet Roman or post-Roman. It is simply a shore rich in grain, cattle, silver and land. From his perspective, the categories we use today, migration, raid, mercenary contract, blur and overlap like the tides. We know the outline in only the vaguest strokes. Roman writers complain of Saxons attacking the British coast in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The term is probably not a neat ethnic label, but a Roman shorthand for various Germanic and North Sea groups using ships to harry the frontier. The Empire responds by building a Saxon shore system of forts and watchtowers. That alone tells us something. The threat is not a one-time panic, but a recurring pattern serious enough to demand stone, garrisons, logistics. Yet when we look for these raiders in the ground, they do not stand up and introduce themselves. Archaeology gives us burned layers in some coastal settlements, a band of charcoal and smashed pottery where quiet occupation once was. In a few places, burials appear with foreign-style brooches or weapons, hints that men who grew up somewhere along the North Sea rim ended their days on British soil. Weapon finds in rivers and bogs increase. But fire can have many causes. A sword can change hands as loot, dowry or heirloom, as easily as through migration or service under a foreign standard. Still, the pattern is hard to ignore. In the later Roman centuries and into the 5th, the flow of people across the water intensifies. Some arrive as hired muscle. Imperial officers recruit boat crews and fighters from the North Sea coast to patrol rivers, guard frontiers and crush rebellions. The pay is good, the loot better, and the Romans, for all their fading power, know how to reward loyal blades. Archaeologically, this may show up as Roman military gear, buckles and belt fittings, appearing in Scandinavian graves far from any legionary camp. Others come as settlers, whether invited or not. Small groups land, perhaps first as seasonal visitors or semi-legal tenants, and over time their houses, burial grounds and pottery styles begin to spread inland. In some regions of eastern Britain the change is gradual, field systems shifting, local elites adopting new fashions. In others the break feels sharper, with earlier sites abandoned and new villages laid out on different lines. And then there are the raids. Fast strikes in shallow draft ships at night or in fog, hitting rich villas, undefended ports, coastal storehouses. The archaeology of a raid is often just absence, goods that are no longer there, coins that stop appearing, a villa whose last mosaic is left unfinished. Sometimes there are violent clues, skeletons with blade wounds, hoards hurriedly buried and never retrieved, but more often the sea keeps its own counsel. When did a warband rowing towards Britain think of itself as migrating? When as serving Rome? When as simply taking what it could? Probably the answer changed even during a single voyage. A crew hired 1 year as Federate guards might, a few seasons later, find themselves unpaid, unwelcome, and suddenly indistinguishable from pirates. A settlement begun as a winter camp for mercenaries' families might harden, over decades, into a permanent community that remembers little and cares less about old Roman contracts. From our distance, we like clear labels and tidy arrows on maps. Here, Saxon invasion. Here, Federati settlement. The record refuses to cooperate. It gives us ragged evidence and tempts us into simple stories that the material cannot truly sustain. We can say that violence grows in this period, that the institutions which once constrained it, imperial law, tax systems, garrisons, are thinning out. We can say that leaders emerge who are able to gather dozens of ships, hundreds of men, and point them at particular stretches of coast. We can say that seafaring itself multiplies the reach of ambition. A chieftain with 3 boats is a local nuisance. A chieftain with 30 is a regional power. A chieftain whose name is known on both sides of the sea is something closer to a king, whether anyone uses that word or not. Who exactly these early sea kings were, we do not know. A few names float up in the later sagas and chronicles, half-legendary figures framed by writers who barely understood the world they were describing. Archaeology gives us their hall foundations, their boat graves, their hoarded silver, but not their voices. What we can feel is the shape of the world that made them possible. A North Sea crisscrossed by oar marks and wake lines, shores studded with landing places and small harbours, communities both fearful of and dependent on the men who command the ships, violence that can arrive, vanish, and return again before crops have time to ripen. Long before the dragon-prowed longships of later centuries, authority in the north is already learning to float. Power becomes something you can push off from the beach, something you can take with you over the horizon, something that can appear out of the mist with spears and shields and demands. In that dim space between Rome's decline and the first written mention of Vikings, sea kings without chronicles are already ruling by oar and tide. We meet one of their ships in a bog again. Far to the north and west, on the fjord-cut coast of what is now western Norway, 2 boats were laid in the peat at Kvalsund sometime in the late Iron Age, around the 7th century. One of them, the larger, is the one that concerns us. When it was excavated in the 20th century, its timbers warped and blackened by centuries underground, it did not look like a legend. It looked like work. But quietly, it rewrites what we think northern shipwrights could do before anyone has heard of Vikings. The Kvalsund boat is long and fine-lined, somewhere around 18 metres from stem to stern, clinker-built, like Nydam, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, flexing with the sea instead of fighting it. But the details are different. The hull is narrower and deeper-bellied. The keel plank is more pronounced, hinting at better performance in a seaway. Instead of the broad, shallow river runner of Jutland, we are looking at a coastal voyager built for the sharp moods of Atlantic water. That alone tells us something about regional variation. On the quiet inlets of southern Denmark, builders could afford broad beams and minimal keel. Grounding out on a sandbank was an inconvenience, not a disaster. Along the broken, rock-strewn coast of western Norway, a different sea dictated different choices. You needed a hull that would track in swell, bite into chop, and give you a little more forgiveness when a squall rolled down off the mountains. You still wanted shallow draft to creep onto beaches and into river mouths, but you also wanted a spine. So the Kvalsund boat sits somewhere between 2 worlds. Not yet the ocean-running longship of later centuries. No sail rig survives to prove anything about masts or rigging, but also not just a fat river barge. It is what you build when your everyday journeys involve headlands, open reaches between islands, fast-changing weather. From the way the thwarts and oarports are placed, archaeologists estimate a crew of perhaps 12 to 20 oarsmen, plus a few extra bodies for steering and handling cargo. We're already beyond the family canoe and into something that requires social organisation, practice, command. A boat like this is a tool for people who think of water as a road they can push into almost any day the sky allows. We do not have a captain's log from Kvalsund, but we can lay out step by cautious step what a crossing in such a boat might have involved. What follows is not a diary recovered from the mud, but an illustration built from the hull's capabilities and from what we know about similar craft and coasts. It is a thought experiment in oaken salt. Imagine a late summer morning in the fjord. The boat sits half drawn up on a strip of cobbled beach, its hull resting easy on rollers and skids. Men move in a slow, practiced rhythm. Sacks of grain, bundles of iron bar for trade, coiled ropes, spare oars, a small chest with weights of silver or weighed bronze. At the bow and stern, carved stem posts curve up and in, not yet the snarling beasts of the later sagas, but still markers of pride. Tar and smoke cling to the planking. Every plank has been seen, tapped, argued over this spring. Someone has watched the weather since dawn. Low wind, a grey high cloud ceiling, the mountains on the far side of the fjord sharp rather than blurred. Good enough. They time their launch for the tide. A shouted count, a push as one, the scrape of wood on wet stones. The hull floats free with a slight shiver as the water takes its weight. Men wade and clamber aboard, boots dripping, feet finding the familiar notches on the thwart. The steerboard man settles at the stern, hand on the great side-hung oar that will keep the boat's nose where it should be. Rowing in such a craft is not frantic. It cannot be. You're not sprinting, you're covering distance. 12, 14 men sit facing aft, oars out, waiting. The steersman gives a word, the first stroke bites and the boat creeps, then glides, then begins to move with that animal. Sliding gait you feel only in a long hull when everyone is roughly in time. Iron rings rasp softly in their holes, oak flexes, the overlapping strakes working with each small wave. The rhythm settles. Pull, breathe, recover, pull. No drum most days. Just a chant that rises when the men feel like it. Or silence broken by the creak of gear, the slap of water along the freeboard. They keep the land close. This is not blue water navigation. It is pilotage by eye and memory. An experienced steersman threads the boat out along the fjord, reading lines of darker water where currents shear, watching birds, the way swell rebounds off certain cliff faces. Each headland has a name, a story tied to it, and those stories double as route instructions. Past the rock that looks like a man lying down, aim for the notch in the next island. When the river mouth comes abeam, you are halfway. By midday, shoulders are burning. Rowers swap places with passengers. One man curls against a bundle of rope and dozes in the lee of the gunwale while his cousin takes his oar. Someone passes along dried fish, hard bread that has to be soaked in a shared bucket before teeth can do anything with it. A boy, the youngest on board, is given the useless jobs. Bail a little, coil that line again, keep his hands busy so he does not notice the long hours. As the day stretches, weather changes. A breeze thickens the water, raising a low, short chop that slaps the bow. This is where the Kvalsund hull earns its keep. That more defined keel helps her track, keeps her from skidding sideways with every wave. The sharpness of the bow cuts rather than slams. Still, the men feel it. Each stroke has to fight not just distance but weight and motion. The chant breaks, then resumes slower, less for encouragement now than for keeping minds off the ache in the arms. Even in summer, no one is eager to be caught far from land at night. So in the late afternoon, the steersman begins to angle inwards, looking for shelter. A cove tucked behind an island, a river mouth deep enough to nose into, a strand where the surf does not hammer too hard. They read the colour of the water for depth, the pattern of kelp for submerged rock. A mistake here means a cracked plank, a sprung rivet, a night on a beach trying to plug a leak with moss and prayers. When they find what they want, the oars back water, the boat loses way, turns under the steerboard's guidance and comes in slow. A man in the bow, boat hook ready, feels for the bottom. They do not always haul her ashore. Sometimes they anchor in shallow water. A stone-weighted line dropped from the bow, the stern swung around so the swell takes them on the quarter instead of straight across. Night in such a boat is a crowded, intimate thing. Cloaks pulled tight, bodies wedged wherever they can. Someone wakes every so often to check the anchor line, to peer at the shift of stars through gaps in cloud, to listen to the wind in the fjord mouth. Navigation, here, is as much an ear for weather as an eye for landmarks. If the wind backs into the wrong quarter, if the air suddenly feels rawer, they may decide to stay put a day, lose time rather than risk a crossing with the fjord turned against them. Nothing in this little imagined voyage is certain for Kvalsund in particular. We do not know precisely which routes that boat travelled, exactly how many men sat in it on its longest days, which songs they used to set their stroke. What the excavated hull does tell us solidly is that by the late Iron Age northern boat builders could create a vessel capable of such work. Clinker-built, keel-backed, light enough to haul out, strong enough for rough coasts. The rest, the rhythm of oars, the saw backs, the wary scan of cloud and headland, is an attempt to fill that hull with life, to give shape to what a crossing meant in human terms. Not an abstract line on a map, but hours of effort, shared strain, tiny decisions about wind and tide that, added together, made it possible for people and ideas to travel all along the broken edge of the Northern Sea. By the time we reach the late 6th and 7th centuries, the world around the North Sea has thickened with people, with kingdoms, with names that will eventually show up in chronicles. But on the shores of a quiet lake in Uppland, in what is now eastern Sweden, we meet a different kind of record. Here, at places we call Vendel and Valsgärde, the ship never leaves the land. Imagine the same kind of long, slender hull that could have rowed along a fjord, but this time dragged up into a low mound of turf and sand, anchored forever in the soil. Not to rot in some forgotten boatyard, but as the centrepiece of a grave. A ship turned on its side, not literally but conceptually, from vehicle to monument, from tool to throne. Archaeologists call this the Vendel era, the centuries just before anyone writes the word Viking. In these graves, that label feels almost beside the point. What they show us is an elite culture whose prestige is soaked in water, whose idea of rulership is inseparable from the image of a ship. The burials themselves are small fleets under the earth. At Vendel and Valsgärde, boats 8, 10, 12 metres long were laid in trenches, their planks and rivets carefully arranged. In some mounds we find only the ghost of a hull, rows of rivets marking where wood once lay, outlines traced in rust. But inside that outline, the dead man was laid out like a captain on permanent station. Around him, war gear piled in quiet abundance, helmets with iron frameworks and decorated plates, face masks with staring metal eyes, shields with iron bosses, ringmail byrnies folded at his side, spearheads and sword blades, some pattern welded in rippling bands, the work of smiths who understood beauty and fear as parts of the same craft. There are animals too, or their bones. Horses, sometimes whole, sometimes only heads and hooves, placed as if to follow their owner into the next world. Dogs at his feet, birds on ornaments and buckles, eagles, ravens, stylized beasts whose bodies knot into each other in the restless interlaced style of northern art. Even when the creature is not aquatic, the designs curl and flow like waves. The ship frames all of this. It is not a background detail, it is the stage. To be buried in a boat is to say something about who you were, or who people wanted you to be remembered as, not just a fighter, a man for whom travel mattered, a man whose power was imagined in terms of movement along water. We do not have their words for these ideas. What we have is pattern. Helmets from Vendel, Uppland, and elsewhere in Scandinavia echo each other, and they echo finds far to the south and west. Bronze and gilt silver fittings show riders and warriors in rows, standard bearers with birds perched on poles, stylized ships with tall stems. The war gear is not purely functional. It performs. It glitters in low northern light. It turns a human body into a walking emblem of a warrior aristocracy that claims the right to rule. That performance is tied to the sea. On some shield mounts and helmet plates, scholars see ships rendered in shorthand. Long hulls with upturned ends, lines of dots for men or shields along the gunwale. On strap ends and buckles, serpents twist into shapes that might be whales or sea dragons or currents. When a chieftain in such gear stood on a shore or in a hall, he was not just a man with a sword. He was a symbol for the group's ability to gather crews, to launch boats, to appear by water where others could not. And this is not happening in isolation. The styles of the Vendel graves whisper across the North Sea. The gilded helmet from Sutton Hoo in East Anglia is not a copy of a Vendel helmet, but it is close enough to feel like a cousin. Same segmented construction, same garnet-inlaid mounts, same animal-style art running along its surfaces. Shield bosses, sword pommels, harness fittings from England, Frisia, southern Scandinavia all share motifs, techniques, sometimes almost identical patterns. Metalwork travels more easily than ships in the archaeological record, but it hints at something bigger. Craftsmen, or at least their ideas, are moving. Marriage partners move, hostages and foster children move, and with them, quietly, go news, stories, the memory of what lies across that strip of grey water. Were there organised fleets in this period, commanded like later royal navies? We do not know. The graves at Vendel and Valsgärde feel princely, but we do not yet see the hard skeleton of a centralised state. Perhaps these were local sea lords whose power rose and fell with their fortunes in war and trade. Perhaps some answered to greater kings. The texts are thin, the ground only selectively generous. How far did their ships range? The grave goods show links to the Baltic, to the North Sea, to continental Europe. Imported glass, Byzantine or Frankish metalwork, garnets from far to the southeast. These things did not float to Uppland by accident. Someone carried them, hand to hand along rivers and coasts, or in the holds of the very boats that later became tombs. But the exact routes remain a blur. Did an upland chieftain's own hull cut the swells of the open Baltic, or did his influence move through chains of lesser leaders and skippers? Were there regular, named sea roads, or just a constantly shifting web of journeys stitched together by memory and chance? The evidence lets us say that connections existed, that ideas and objects could cross the North Sea and back. It does not yet let us draw all the lines between the dots, so in the Vendel ship burials we are left with a strong outline and a soft centre. We see an elite that thought in maritime terms, that treated the ship as a throne and a coffin, as the ultimate sign of status. We see war gear turned into portable myth, animals and vessels and weapons merged into a single visual language of power. We see that this language was not confined to one shore, but spoke across water. What we do not see yet is the full shape of the political structures behind it, or the day-to-day reality of the fleets that must have carried these people and their goods around the northern seas. Those ships in life left almost no trace. Only when they stopped moving, when they became beds for the dead, do they stand still long enough for us to find them. Follow that whisper of style and metalwork across the water, and it leads us to a low ridge above a muddy river in what is now eastern England, Sutton Hoo. On the surface it is another cluster of mounds, another cemetery on a windy height. But under one of those mounds, long ago someone laid out a ship, not a Swedish lake boat this time, but a full seagoing hull, nearly 30 metres from stem to stern, its prow pointing toward the River Deben, and beyond that, the grey restless width of the North Sea. Like the Vendel ships, the Sutton Hoo vessel has vanished as wood. What survives is the negative, a long dark stain in the sand, rows of iron rivets marking out the curve of plank upon plank. A ghost of a keel that once knew salt water. Around and within it, the remains of a burial so rich that when it was uncovered in the 20th century, people reached for words like pharaonic. We do not know with absolute certainty whose body lay in that ship. Many scholars connect the grave with Redwald, a king of the East Angles who died in the early 7th century. Others urge more caution, pointing out the lack of unburnt human bone, the possibility of cenotaph or symbolic burial. The name may be uncertain, the message is not. Everything in that ship says rulership, wealth, connection. Gold and garnets worked into clasps and fittings of almost painful precision. Silver dishes from the eastern Mediterranean, stamped with imperial marks, drinking horns and cups, a great iron stand for a cauldron, a lyre to accompany songs, weapons, a mail shirt, spears, a long pattern-welded sword whose hilt mounts shimmer with red stones cut to catch the light, and there, among the fittings, the helmet. Segmented, crested, edged with plaques of tinned bronze and garnet inlay, a face mask turning the wearer into a stern, metal-eyed being. Put it alongside the helmets from Vendel or Valsgärde, and the family resemblance is almost unnerving. The same construction in zones, the same taste for animal bodies twisting into each other, the same way of turning a human head into a kind of moving icon. This is not an accident of two distant peoples having similar ideas. The patterns, the techniques, the very grammar of the decoration point to craftsmen who shared a tradition, or at least to workshops in dialogue with each other. Sutton Hoo does not prove that an East Anglian king was Swedish, or that a Swedish chieftain ruled England. What it does show is that the elite on both shores of the North Sea were swimming in the same cultural waters. Think about what that implies. For a helmet of that sort to exist in East Anglia, designs had to move. Metalworkers or their apprentices had to cross seas, or finished pieces had to be carried as gifts, payments, heirlooms. The gold in the purse lid, the garnets in the clasps, the silk fragments and Byzantine silver. Each of these things travelled a different route, handed along river valleys, down coasts through royal halls. The ship itself, the very idea that a dead ruler should lie in a boat hauled up and buried, is part of that same web. Ship burial is not uniquely Scandinavian. Sutton Hoo shows it taking root in an insular kingdom that faced the North Sea, not the Baltic. To choose a ship as the container for a king's last journey is to declare that his identity is bound to water. His power lay not only over fields and villages inland, but over the approaches by sea, over who could land where, over who could move along that highway of waves and estuaries. And because the sea is a highway, not a wall, it becomes a political stage long before anyone talks about Viking fleets. Across that stage, relationships play out in motion. A marriage alliance might sail from a Frankish port to Kent, from Kent to East Anglia, from East Anglia to some nameless shore in Denmark. A hostage prince, fostered abroad, learns another language, hears songs of heroes from across the water. A merchant brings news of a new emperor, a new tax, a new war. A raiding party returns with foreign gear that, a generation later, is repurposed as grave goods in a royal mound. Sutton Hoo sits right on that crossroads. The burial does not let us map every diplomatic tie, every exchange of brides and gifts. It does not draw a neat arrow from an upland chieftain's hall straight to an East Anglian throne. What it lets us say is simpler, and more important. By the early 7th century, the North Sea is already a shared world for a seafaring elite. An Anglo-Saxon king can be imagined, and can imagine himself as part of the same sea-born aristocracy whose symbols we saw at Vendel. His smiths speak a visual language that answers to theirs. His status is measured in things that arrived by ship, in the ability to command men to row and sail, to appear and disappear along the coasts. When we think about before the Vikings, Sutton Hoo is a quiet correction to any story that treats 793 as the sudden beginning of northern seafaring. Long before that famous raid, kings were being laid in ships. Long before the chronicles complain about dragon prows on the horizon, the sea had already woven together rival courts, rival warbands, rival claims to rule. The ships of this age rarely survive. The woodrots, the names are lost. But in a sandy ridge above the Deben and in lakeside mounds in upland, we see that the idea of power tied to a hull, to the crossing of water, was already fully formed. The stage is set. The actors are learning their lines. The sea is not waiting for the Vikings. It is already full. If you stand with all of this in your mind, the carvings of long hulls under the sun, the bronze razors and rock panels, the lake boats hauled up into mounds, the river ships laid out as thrones for dead kings, and you look toward the date we are taught as the beginning, 793 feels less like a sudden blow and more like a step taken on a road that has been running for more than 1,000 years. Go back to the cliffs and outcrops of Bohuslän. There, in the polished scars of granite, men in the Bronze Age were already pecking out scenes of rowed ships so crowded with crew that the hulls bulge with tiny stick figures. Prows curl into animal heads. Sun discs hover above the waves. Whatever stories those pictures told, they assumed boats as a given, as everyday as ploughs or spears. Move forward to Hjortspring, a war canoe built before Rome had finished conquering the Mediterranean, long, light, meant for speed and surprise along coasts and into inlets. Then to Nydam, where planks and ribs still remember the push of oars on a grey choppy day in some forgotten campaign. To Kvalsund, sturdy and seaworthy on the outer edges of Norway's fjords. To Vendel and Valsgärde, where ships are not just transport but symbols, turned into coffins for the rich dead. To Sutton Hoo, watching over the North Sea. Each of these finds is a still photograph from a moving film. None of them shows us the whole story. But together, they tell us that by the 6th and 7th centuries, people of the North were perfectly capable of building large ocean-going wooden ships, crewing them with trained men, and navigating long stretches of open water. They had been working up to this for centuries. The knowledge is cumulative: how to cut planks so they spring into the right curve, how to fasten them so a hull flexes but does not break, how to read a coast in fog, how to find a river mouth by the smell of fresh water and the colour of the waves. So what changes as we walk toward the late 8th century? Not the sudden discovery of the sea. What changes is scale, and who is watching and who is writing anything down. The people buried in the Hjortspring boat were already raiders of a kind, or at least warriors prepared to fight arriving by water. The men who rowed Nydam would have looked to a frightened villager on a shore, much like the men who would come later. Shields along the gunwales, weapons close at hand, the long low silhouette of a warship closing the distance. But in the early centuries the scale of operations is likely small. A few tens of men, a limited season, politics local and regional. When those boats cross the North Sea or the Skagerrak, they move between communities that share languages, gods, kinship myths. Conflict is frequent, but it is part of a world that does not yet care to record its quarrels in writing. By the time we reach the threshold of 793, the wider context has shifted. To the south and west, literate kingdoms and churches keep annals, letters, law codes. Rulers think in terms of tribute, taxation, official borders. A monastery on a Northumbrian island is not just a cluster of huts and stone buildings. It is plugged into a network that stretches to Rome, to Francia, to the Mediterranean. When fast ships from the north hit a place like that, the impact is no longer just local. It is noticed by people who think in chronicles and charters. It is described with horror in Latin, copied, recopied, preserved. A kind of spotlight snaps on. From that moment in the written record, the sea kings we call Vikings become visible in a way their predecessors never were. We have names for some of their leaders, dates for some of their expeditions, even occasional details about fleet sizes and treaty terms. The ships themselves are not radically new. What is new is the intensity of use, the distance some expeditions cover, and the density of surviving documentation. At the same time, much continues almost unchanged. The basic principles of clinker construction, of lapstrake planking fastened with iron rivets, are the same ones already perfected in the Nydam hull. The idea of a ship as a vehicle of power and as an appropriate container for the dead has been embedded in northern aristocratic culture for generations. The coastline routes from Norway down to Jutland, across to Frisia, up to England and Scotland are old. Fishermen and traders and raiders have been following those lines of headlands and sandbanks since long before anyone thought to date a raid on Lindisfarne. Even some of the most iconic elements of later northern seafaring are probably older than we can currently prove. Sails, for instance. Our hard evidence for proper rigged sailing ships in this region is late. Scraps of cloth impressions on fittings, a few depictions, archaeological timbers that clearly bore mast steps from around the mid to late first millennium. But the rock carvings of the Nordic Bronze Age sometimes show ships with what might be stylized rigging or raised elements. Are those really sails, or banners, or something else entirely? We do not know. It is very likely that small simple sails were in sporadic use before they show up clearly in the record. The sea often gives nothing back of what was once draped over wooden frames. Leadership, too, is obscure. We can see the end result in the great burials, ship graves under mounds, helmets and mail, feasting gear. Clearly someone is commanding the labour to build those boats, the wealth to fill those halls, the oaths of the men who row. But how exactly were these early sea lords chosen? Were they kings in the sense we recognise from later sources, or more like pre-state war leaders, first among near equals, their authority fragile and personally won? The archaeology hints at networks of alliances, of retinues, of gift-giving that flow along the coasts and up the rivers. The exact rules remain murky. No treaties survive from the Bronze Age, no law codes from the age of Hjortspring. And then there are the routes we can only guess at. Amber from the Baltic turns up in Mycenaean graves. Roman coins end up on Scandinavian shores. Byzantine silk makes its way into Sutton Hoo. We know some of the lines that must have connected these points. Others are still shadows on the map. Minor harbours never excavated, seasonal markets swallowed by later towns, river landings where nothing was ever built in stone. The world, in other words, is already maritime when that famous entry in a Northumbrian chronicle complains of heathen men coming by sea. By the time an anonymous scribe sets down the date 793 in the name of Lindisfarne, people along the northern coasts have been living with the rhythms of wind and tide for longer than their own myths remember. Their ancestors carved ships beside images of the sun. They buried their chiefs in boats. They set out into grey dawns, not knowing exactly what lay beyond the next headland, but knowing that the way forward was always along the water. The raid that opens the Viking Age in our textbooks does not create that seafaring world. It merely catches it, mid-movement, in the brief, unforgiving light of someone else's pen. So why do we remember one moment and forget the long rolling sea behind it? Part of the answer is simple. Noise. The centuries before 793 are quiet in the kinds of sources historians lean on. No local monasteries keeping neat lists of bad years and strange visitors. No letters between bishops grumbling about missing tithes. No royal biographies needing a dramatic sea raid to make a king look brave. The people sailing Hjortspring, Nydam, Kvalsund, even the shadowy fleets that must have linked the amber shores of the Baltic to the wider world, lived mostly outside the written gaze. Their stories were sung in halls, told around hearths, folded into genealogies and myths. When those oral traditions finally do surface in ink, they are already blurred, rearranged, claimed by later dynasties. The old voyages are not gone, but they have been repackaged as legend. Meanwhile, the monks at Lindisfarne and elsewhere write in a medium that outlives them. Ink on parchment, copied in scriptoria far from the spray and salt. When they say, Northmen came by sea and did terrible things, their fear becomes an official memory. It is catalogued, archived, cited. Centuries later, someone leafs through those pages and decides that this, here, is the beginning of an age. Archaeology, which ought to balance the record, has its own kind of bias. Wood rots, cloth and rope vanish. Harbours built of stakes and brush and tamped earth disappear under later wharves, or under farmland that has been ploughed for 1,000 years. What survives best are the strange accidents. A boat deliberately sunk in a bog, a ship buried under a mound, a hoard lost in a marsh. We dig where the ground is kind to us, in peat, in sand, under burial mounds. We map what we can see, rock carvings on open cliffs, great tumuli on ridges, the everyday landing places, the small beachheads where men dried nets and beached their boats, remain mostly invisible. So the picture we have of the pre-Viking sea is a chain of bright isolated beads. The long ordinary string that joins them is still largely hidden. Then there is the way modern culture likes its stories. Vikings is a convenient label, short, memorable, easy to turn into sports team names, TV shows, museum exhibitions. It suggests a distinct people, a clean beginning and end, a brand. National movements in the 19th and 20th centuries were happy to adopt that brand, to cast themselves as heirs of bold sea kings, rather than of anonymous Bronze Age farmers and fishers. Those earlier sailors do not fit so neatly on a flag or a film poster. They belong to a time before clear ethnic labels, before nation-states, before anyone thought in terms of Swedes or Danes or Norwegians. They are harder to claim, harder to simplify, so they slip quietly into the background. In reality, there is no sharp line. The men we think of as Vikings are just the latest verse in a song that has been going on for a very long time, on the same coasts, under the same low clouds, over the same restless water. The earlier verses are fainter because they were sung into air and not onto parchment, into timber that has long since softened back into soil. If you listen carefully, you can still imagine them. Oars dipping in unison, the soft thud and creak of wood, the hiss of a hull pushing through morning mist, a boat slipping past a headland with no one to write its name down. Another farther out, just a darker line on the grey, gone again when the fog closes. History remembers the Vikings because the light happened to fall on them. The right kind of witnesses, the right kind of fear, the right kind of later storytellers. The people before them were not erased by conspiracy or catastrophe. They faded the way most human lives fade, into the gaps between what we choose to record and what the earth is willing to preserve. But their work remains, built into the very idea of the North as a seafaring world. Every famous longship rides on a deep unseen swell of earlier experiments, forgotten crossings, nameless crews. The Viking Age is a bright crest on a much older wave. If you've drifted with me this far, feel free to gently tap that like button, subscribe if you'd like more slow journeys into the past, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. If you'd like to keep wandering through hidden chapters of deep time, I've written a book about prehistoric secrets and the strange paths that led to us. You can find it, along with more sleepy history, at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, let the names fall away and just hear the steady beat of the oars fading into fog. Long before anyone said Viking, that sound was already echoing across the northern sea.